And now, two guys that have something in common with Sylvester Stallone. Yes, all three of us got snubbed by last night's Academy Awards. This is Beyond Sunday Morning. This week's special guest is Erin Grasse.
Well, welcome back. This is another episode of Beyond Sunday Morning. I'm one of your hosts, Clayton, and with me is Drew. And Drew, we have someone very special with us today.
Actually, when did you get promoted up to one of the hosts? I think you're like the assistant.
I thought that was your title.
No, I don't think so. But we do have somebody. It's always nice to have people much more talented and bright than either one of us joining us today. And that's exactly what we have. We have Erin Grasse. Erin, how are you?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I am good. So you're a senior at William & Mary.
Indeed.
Religious Studies. Mm-hmm. You have written for the Huffington Post twice. You're published.
I am. It's a strange feeling.
Clayton also has written for the Huffington Post. You want to tell them a little bit about that?
In the comments section.
Oh, in the comments section. Solid work. So.
I don't want to, say much. I don't want to brag or anything, but it's been more than one time.
Okay. And then they banned you.
Absolutely, I got banned.
And he was blocked.
That's right.
Right, Erin.
I used your name as my handle.
Oh, mine? That's great.
Yes.
Well, Erin has written several articles, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to have her on. She is a student that came out of my youth group, which is very nice. It's nice to know, that I can look back and pick one or two people that I'm proud of, and Erin is one of them. She kept me on target a lot in life, and lots of good stories. Which we will not divulge here. We don't.
Okay,
we want you to come back. Don't want to embarrass you.
I was more worried about you than me, but.
Oh, wow. Look at you, Miss Witty. All right. Well, I like it. Well, what's our topic today, Clayton?
Well, our topic today is a little bit about Martin Luther King Jr., a little bit about racism and religion and how society plays into all of this. It's going to be a fun-filled episode, and I know Erin is here to lead us in this conversation.
Or we were going to just have the conversation, but way to throw her under the bus.
Solid
work.
What am I here for?
Yeah, well, and I think one of the things, Erin picked out a couple of great articles. One from The Atlantic, teaching Martin Luther King's life, The Man, Not the Myth, by Melinda D. Anderson. As well as another one, How Martin Luther King Became Safe, by Reverend Dr. David Gushee. And we're going to talk about both these articles. We've read them. We're going to use them as a jumping off point to have this conversation. And I really do appreciate the ways in which we have kind of this conversation about how safe should we make Martin Luther King Jr. Because I think we've almost sterilized him in some ways and not really taken to heart his message. So I know you guys have some things to say about that. Erin, what are your thoughts?
Oh gosh, I'm trying to collect all of them. I think that is very much problematic. My campus ministry, the Wesley Foundation at William & Mary, just went on a civil rights and faith trip to Birmingham, and we were at the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta, and we were by his tomb, and we were walking along. They have this little walkway of memory for him with lots of pictures from his life and various events. And a couple of us were saying, I think it was something like how much of a great guy he was. And someone said, yes, that's true, but we have to also remember that he's a human person. And he had lots of struggles. He wasn't perfect. We tend to put him on this pedestal, but then the danger of that is we can't relate to him in the sense of we too are capable of making change, and we too have this call and this role to fight for the oppressed in society. But we can't do that if the person we're trying to be is this perfect sanitized version of a leader.
How do you think the modern influences of movies like Selma and pieces like this have really kind of taken that to the forefront and said, he wasn't just a legend, he was truly a man?
I haven't seen Selma personally. I really want to, but I think it is very important for us to reclaim that humanity of Dr. Martin Luther King. Melissa Harris Perry just came to William and Mary for a MLK commemoration speech, and she had talked about how great Dr. King would have been at social media, how great he would have been at like Instagram of posting pictures of nonviolent protest, and how great he would have been at Snapchat of showing pictures of his humanity, and how great he would have been at Twitter with all his like pithy quotations. But under all of that, he would have been a very like human person who is very related to, and it's very hard to help people if they're not actually people.
Erin, I was kind of curious with all of these articles that have come out and even recent motion pictures and everything else. Does culture seem to be kind of correcting itself and trying to speak a little bit more to the man? Or is it kind of continuing and perpetrating this idea of a myth?
Ooh, that's such a good question. There's so many layers to it. I think in many ways I don't know if I would say correcting itself, but maybe adding a different dimension, perhaps. Because there is definitely like this image of King we have who is very dedicated to service and very much the nonviolent advocate that we have known him to be, but also there was so much more in terms of other issues that he was campaigning for, and we don't hear about his failures in the civil rights movement at all, but they were there too. So I think it does add a different dimension. It does make him into a more richer person that perhaps we can relate to better. And I think also those articles too, in very much ways that portray King as an actual person is instead of just this iconic figure.
One of the things you mentioned was some of the other things he campaigned for or spoke to. What are some of those things?
Oh, gosh. Like, for the homelessness problem in Chicago is the one that pops up to me the most. The fact that he was against Vietnam.
That was a big one. That was a big one. And one that actually a lot of people, I remember we actually had the opportunity to see Dr. Vincent Harding, who was one of his speechwriters, come to our seminary, and he said that was the one that people were telling him in the civil rights movement is not to make that speech, not to do it, because it would muddy the waters, it would make him very unpopular, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, just like a true prophet, he said, this is what I think needs to be said at this time. And I think that that's part of what we've kind of taken away from him is this idea that, he felt the need to speak against nonviolence and to live a life. And again, he's not a perfect person, but he wanted to model himself after the nonviolence of Jesus. And kind of, I know at one point, Clayton, you've talked a little bit about this as well, that we've almost stripped away his religious motivations, his religious beliefs, away from who he is in order to make him this national hero that everyone can just get and rally behind.
Yeah, kind of a sanitized version of what motivates him as a man. I found this really interesting. Even the Atlantic article by Anderson, which I really appreciated, spoke very little to his faith. And I've always been kind of curious of, we don't speak to who he was in the fact that he was motivated primarily by his understandings of Jesus as a liberator. One of the things that I found really interesting was actually in the David Gushee article was the fact that he speaks extensively to the idea that he gave his life to God. And it's really kind of an interesting question. Where do you see that playing out in our understanding of him? Do you see us as a culture kind of embracing him as a religious figure as well, or just merely as a political figure?
I think it's honestly mostly as a political figure. I remember when I learned about him, I think he was always just Martin Luther King Jr. And then when the title of like Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. started being attached, it was like, oh, what does that mean? And it still didn't really sink in until, like I said, when I was on the Civil Rights and Faith trip, like when we went to his home church and heard all about how active he had been in there and that he grew up there and the fact that he was a minister. The Reverend wasn't actually just a fun title. That is, I think, another, again, dimension kind of what I just said, that people don't really know about him or how important churches were in the civil rights movement and how they were these centers of people coming together and rallying and being able to form communities of solidarity to be able to fight these oppressive structures, but we don't talk about those anymore.
I
or at
wonder,
all.
yeah, and that's absolutely true. I wonder too, in some ways, modern day prophets. We as a church, we especially in our society today, have kind of taken any kind of prophetic voice, any kind of questions about oppression and any of the isms. I mean, you can take your pick.
There's so
And
many.
unfortunately, there are. And basically have said, well, we can't have a conversation anymore about any of these things. We have to water down every conversation so that we're not offensive. We don't have pastors, for the most part, who are willing to step up and say, you know what, I really have concerns about this from a social justice standpoint about what are we doing. And I think, and certainly in the civil rights movement, there were white pastors who did stand up, but certainly not enough. There were some people, who were a privilege who also supported them, but clearly not enough. In fact, there were a lot of pastors using the Bible, using Scripture to perpetuate the system. And I wonder, in some ways, has that really changed today? And are we comfortable with even the call that we have? I always say pastors really have three calls. So, and this comes, I think, from a pastor I heard from Perry Noble, that we're called to be priest, we're called to be prophet, and we're called to be protector.
Ooh.
And I don't think we really embrace the prophet part of it because it's dangerous, because it costs us something. And I think that that's something that Martin Luther King Jr., he understood and was willing to go there no matter the cost. And to pretend like it was just, I think it was the Gushy article where he says, people who come and aggressively challenge, and talk about service and dreams and a colorblind America, they don't get beat up, arrested, and murdered. But prophets do. And prophets get kicked out of places, and they get turned away from the society and from the institutions that they speak out against. And I wonder, in some ways, are we at a point in our history where more prophets need to speak up, but again, we're just scared to because we've seen what's happened in the past too much, and so we sanitize these great prophets. We take away their fangs, their claws, and just turn them into national heroes that everyone can get behind. And you, young people, get a day off of school.
I think you're right, but I don't think this is something that we're just dealing with. One of my favorite pieces by Martin Luther King Jr. is, of course, his piece from the Birmingham jail. And one of the things that he says that one of his greatest concerns and one of his greatest regrets is moderate white folks. And he says, in essence, they're the stumbling block because they love peace over justice. They love order over justice because it makes us uncomfortable. I think one thing you're naming for us, Drew, is the fact that the prophetic voice in our church and in our society has been reduced because it makes us uncomfortable. And I was going to ask a question maybe to the two of you, is what is the role of the church? When we think about Martin Luther King Jr., and we actually talk about Reverend, the church had a place of prominence in his movement, especially the African-American church. Do you see that prominence playing out today in the church? And if it's not, what do you think we need to do? I mean, because there's this great cry, I think, Drew, you're naming it for us, is we need a prophetic voice. Where's the church at today?
Well, I think the question is what kind of church? Because I think, again, it depends on where you are. I think it depends on what your makeup is. Are you a church of oppressed people? Which Martin Luther King Jr. served a church of oppressed people, and I think, again, it was much easier for people to sit back, again, the white moderate church, the white moderate pastors, to sit back and do nothing because it was the safe play. They weren't actively being racist. They weren't going out and lynching people. But in a lot of ways, they were allowing racism to continue through their silence, and they were agreeing with it with their silence. And I think in some ways, we continue to do that today. We don't want to have conversations about any of the isms. We don't want to have a talk about racism. We don't want to talk about sexism. We don't want to talk about... And I think ultimately that we should be having those conversations. We should be saying enough with the silence. Let's move forward from here. And maybe that's the greatest gift in some ways that white, powerful pastors could have had at that time, was a conversation about, well, what does the gospel really say? Not what, the person down the lane is telling everybody, but let's really talk about this. Let's talk about, what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? What does it mean that all people are created in the image of God? And then if this is what it means, then who should we stand with? There's a great quote. I believe, I should have researched this ahead of time. I'm getting in trouble because I'm going to quote it anyway. It's from the Jewish Holocaust, and it says, "A country is not defined by the atrocities it commits. It's defined by the atrocities it allows to happen." And I know that's not the exact quote, but that's the general gist of it. And basically calling out that just because you weren't in league with Hitler and the Nazis, that doesn't excuse you from allowing them to do what they were doing and to just sit back and watch. And so I think in some ways that King, in his letter to the Birmingham jail, was saying the exact same thing. It isn't about, you not going out and killing, African American people. It's not about, you going out. The problem is that you're allowing it to happen because of your silence. And we just haven't gotten good at that. Our culture doesn't want to do that either. I mean, I can go on the news program and pick out the news that agrees with me. And it's just fine with me. I can go and listen to CNN, I can listen to Fox News, and I can hear people who generally agree with me. We've lost that in our society. And I don't think sterilizing King, I think that's a byproduct of it, because he was not someone that was going to be taken lightly.
Yeah, I'm actually reminded of two King quotes. The first one is one that I absolutely love. "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." It's often the people that stand closest to us and do nothing that becomes the most egregious as far as the wrongdoing. And then the other thing is society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. We have, as a society, we've lost that prophetic voice and that prophetic edge. I'm kind of curious, Erin, I think you can speak to this better than Drew and I can. Where do you see people standing up using this prophetic voice in society today? In relation to even issues of racism. I know we've had the Ferguson issues and everything else, and these affect real people. And where have you seen this form of resistance and prophetic voice being used?
This form of resistance and prophetic voice. Ooh, that's also a big question. I think I was thinking of a Martin Luther King quote while you guys were also saying your Martin Luther King quotes. And the one is, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." And so I think there are obviously lots of very big ways that people can be prophetic. And there certainly are, like Black Lives Matter protests, like people like going on civil rights and faith mission trips, like just stepping out of your comfort zone to be on the side of the oppressed. Those are all very big ways, but there's also very tiny ways of being prophetic as well, in the sense of actively working to ensure that all people are seen as people, whether it's correcting misconceptions, for example, about what Islam is when someone says all Muslims are terrorists or whatnot, or even when it comes to saying that racist joke actually isn't funny, and it was never funny, and I don't know why you keep saying it. Sure. Or speaking out against homophobia or sexism, or just being an ally in general. Listening is very prophetic, because people aren't used to being listened to sometimes, because society tells them they don't matter, because their voices don't matter, that they as a person don't matter. So I guess the places that I've seen people being prophetic the most is when people have difficult conversations, even if it's just between two people, That's being prophetic. When people listen to each other, that's being prophetic. Sometimes when people just serve each other selflessly, that's prophetic. Really, this is, I was trying to think of a bigger way to wrap it all up, but
I think you're naming something though that we struggle with in the church is and
mhm,
something that Drew's even named the fact that we're unwilling to have those hard conversations.
very much so.
And one of the things that I took away from the Anderson article from the Atlantic was one thing that I absolutely loved is how the piece ended in the fact that one way that we can stand up for social inequality is actually teaching. We
Yes.
don't often think about resistance being that passive. But the act of teaching in public schools and in our homes and even in our churches is an act of social justice.
Oh,
And
very much so.
I think that's a beautiful idea, especially as we talk about, what's the role of the church? What's the role of individuals? Well, we need to be there for teaching. What does it mean, as you kind of have articulated, to stop with racism in joke form, to talk about inequality as it exists in the world and as it exists in our neighborhoods. And we often, I think the other thing too is we've pushed this idea out that racism exists somewhere beyond where I am. And
Oh,
the
very
truth is
true.
that racism exists right where I am. It's in the
Hmm.
community that I live, and it's in the community that we all live in, because it is
Yes.
really a societal issue.
Hmm.
And two real quick things. You know where the prophetic voice is not needed is on your Facebook wall. It really,
Absolutely.
really is not, because it's not a conversation. It's just uh being quick and things like that. Have a conversation with someone. And I think part of the problem, what we've run into, is when we don't want to have conversation with someone, we immediately label the person, oh, that person's a bigot, that person's a racist. And instead of saying, let me hear your story, let me hear why you believe what you believe, because
Hmm.
I think that's exactly what they're doing to a group of people, is they're labeling them and dismissing them and putting them down, versus sitting down and saying, okay, so tell me, why do you believe that, why do you think that. And I think that that's so important, and something I struggle with when I hear somebody say something that is I disagree with, is I immediately want to jump down their throat and go, hey, that's really racist remark. That's not helpful. And that's part of the problem. It's just perpetuating exactly what we're talking about, not wanting to have a conversation with someone, not wanting someone to know that, even though I disagree with this piece of what you're saying, we can still be in community. We can still be in relationship with one another. But this is not, I'm not going to allow injustice to dominate our relationship. I will still say, hey, just because I want to be in a relationship with you, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to speak out about this issue, because this is what is right in my opinion. And so I think that that's a very fine line to tread, between being permissive in an individual sense. I think sometimes we can sit and be still in that. But from a societal standpoint, we need to speak out and we need to speak up, and we need to do it sooner rather than later, or else we're just perpetuating racist systems or sexist systems or injustice in whatever forms they present themselves. And I just quoted our membership vows that we are to resist those things in all forms in which they present themselves. And that's something that is important to us as United Methodists moving forward, is, hey, from a societal standpoint, we are the ones that need to speak up and speak out about these various things. But in a personal level, sit down with the person who you may disagree with. Sit down with that person, and when you figure out that there's something inside of you, I mean, it can be super mundane. Like, for example, I'll have lots of people say, well, I won't drive in that part of the city. Well, why is that? Ask yourself, why is that? Why do you jump to that? Why do you think that? What is going on inside of me that makes me judge a person that way or look at a person that way? Because, you know, I haven't always had to deal with these things, and certainly other people have not always had the awareness about these things. And so in some ways, I feel like I'm coming to the game late. I would never grow up as a young woman, so I don't understand sexism like someone who's a young woman, like yourself, Erin, who, has had to deal with that their entire life. And so when I become aware of it, I'm 15, 16, 17, 18 years behind the game. So I would say, again, the idea of sitting with people, of being honest with ourselves, being honest with one another, and listening to one another is so important as we sit down and figure out, hey, how do we combat racism? How do we listen to the prophetic voice, not only in our society, but also within us? It's just so important.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys have any other thoughts or comments?
I think you've really named, again, I think the two of you especially have named, again, just the desire to make this personal and relational. And I think we need more people that are willing to do that. And you talked about stepping out of your comfort zone. And I think that's something that we all need to be practicing and this really comes back to an old practice in the Christian church, is the idea of hospitality. We need to be practicing hospitality for those that are different than us, those that we consider outsiders. And we need to make ourselves aware that God has no outsiders. And I think this is something that we're all called to as Christians. So I think, again, you guys have named that well.
There was, I can't remember where it was from, but just the idea that it's a privilege to be uncomfortable, or it's a privilege to be able to ignore things that make you uncomfortable. That's and right. Just being able to go on with your life as if they're not there. So I had a thought and then it lost its train and now it's back. But the idea that people say all the time that you're not supposed to be comfortable with faith, that being called to love your neighbor as yourself is not just a passive thing that, you can just choose to do. It's something that we're called to do. And in order to be whole ourselves, it's best to be taking care of people. Like, I think it's Fannie Lou Hamer who said, no one's free if not everybody is free, which is a butchered quote. But, and Glennon Doyle Melton, just quote dropping as well, said, we belong to each other. So if there's no peace, it's because we have forgotten that we belong to each other, which she took from Mother Teresa. But that whole idea of stepping out of your comfort zone, because I myself am not free if there are people in this world who are treated as less than human, who are treated as being unworthy, who are told that they can't qualify as children of God. My Christian call is to step out of that comfort zone and say, of course you are, because you and I were both tied together. We both have the same divine heritage. We're both here together. So comfort zones away.
And I think part of the other thing, just to add one more thing, is to realize that we're not always going to get it right. And we have to listen to the other voices. We can't be paternalistic and walk in and say, hey, I've got all the answers. Hey, and say, okay, so this is how it needs to go. But I think humbling ourselves, which is so much a part of who Jesus was. And let me talk to you. I mean, we're talking about Martin Luther King Jr. being, sterilized. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Jesus being sterilized as well. I mean, we've actually changed his perception so that it looks like a Nordic version. Jesus was white? Right.
That always gets me.
I think that's huge. I mean, Jesus is a Palestinian Jew. I mean, there's no other way to go around it. And I think that that's really important. And so we've done that to the most dangerous people, to the status quo. And we've done that for all of history. And so in these ways, we need to embrace the prophetic voice. We need to realize that we're not always going to get it right. And we have to repent when we do get it wrong. But be in relationship with one another, that we give people the opportunity to be wrong as they journey towards really coming together as God's kingdom here on earth. And I think that, again, that's just something we need to do. Any last thoughts, Erin, since you are our guest of honor?
Do I have any last thoughts? I'll probably think of at least 4 as soon as we hang up, but for the time being, I'm just very grateful that you guys had me on here.
Would you come back again at some point?
Oh, sure.
Oh, good. Now we have it on video. Mm-hmm. She can't back out now.
It's a binding
Erin, that's right. Erin, thank you for joining us today.
Yes. And please, you can always leave comments below us to those thoughts afterwards. We're probably going to put this up in the next week. We do record slightly and then put them up later on. But we really do appreciate you. Clayton, you're beautiful today. Did you know that?
Thank you. So are you, Drew.
Thanks. You're very pretty. And I really appreciate it. I'm actually sad that I don't have glasses, because you guys kind of from straight ahead, you guys kind of look like you have very similar styles of glasses, and so I feel like the odd person out.
I was
really
noticing that
needed
too.
A pair of glasses.
Well, you have Josiah, so I mean, you have that.
You're not as cool as us.
I guess that's true. Thank you, Erin, for being gracious as always. Clayton, thanks for being you.
Thank you, Drew.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, and we really appreciate you listening Beyond Sunday Morning. Erin, where can the people find you? Do you have a Twitter account?
I do not.
What was that look?
Doing that.
I just asked, like...
When you said, where can people find you, it just made me sound like I'm like a legitimate deal.
What do you mean? If people want to read your stuff. People want to read your stuff.
Oh.
You are a legitimate deal. Where do people want to find your stuff? Facebook?
The only place I have stuff so far is the... I mean... If you really
need to set up a Twitter account. You need to set up a Twitter account. Right now, we need to set up a Twitter account for you.
It's a binding thing. I'm on the Huffington Post religion section, but I think that's the only place I really exist online, unless you want to be my follower, a part of my network on LinkedIn. But
how about your blog?
Hey.
Don't you have a blog?
I had an old blog. I have.
We're going to cut this entire part out anyway. This is like a train wreck. Sorry, Erin. And we lost her. Oh, no, she's there.
Wi-Fi, fail me now. Oh, I'm back.
There you are. You are. Hey, Erin, why don't you send us the link to your 2 posts, and we'll put them on the page.
That would be good. And you should set up a Twitter account, too.
Oh my God.
Okay, well, I'll talk to you guys later.
My current
Well,
blog
hold
as
on. Clayton, where can the people find you?
At Clayton Payne on Twitter.
And I'm at Drew Ensz. You can read our posts and be very upset with us at how I just destroyed this whole interview. Luckily, there's the power of editing. Thank you all very much, and we'll talk to you later.